5,000 German tanks never made it back from the Eastern Front, and the reason was a Soviet war machine that soldiers came to fear more than almost anything else in the sky. This was no sleek fighter and no nimble interceptor. It was a beast, wrapped in armor, spitting fire, and hunting convoys until nothing moved but smoke and burning steel. German troops whispered its nickname with dread, the Black Death. But here's the disturbing part. For decades, the official Soviet records never quite lined up with reality. The numbers were exaggerated, the destruction was glorified, and hidden beneath the propaganda are darker truths about what this plane could and could not do. By the end of this video, you'll see why some call the Ilyushin IL-2 both the deadliest weapon of the Eastern Front and one of history's most overrated legends. Stick around, because the story only gets more horrifying the deeper we go. And before we begin, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we've got even more World War II stories coming, each one packed with secrets they never wanted you to know. Long before the IL-2 Sturmovik terrorized the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union had been chasing a dream that most engineers called impossible: building an aircraft that could carry heavy armor and still remain fast enough to strike on the battlefield. In the early 1930s, Soviet designers experimented with armored ground attack prototypes like the TS-1 and Grigorovich's armored biplanes. On paper, these creations looked like flying fortresses, but in practice, they were dead ends. The engines of the time simply couldn't drag all that steel into the air at combat speed. The concept of an airborne flying tank was filed away, a fantasy for another era. That all began to change in 1938. In Moscow, a determined engineer named Sergei Ilyushin and his design team at the Central Design Bureau revived the idea with a bold new plan. They envisioned a single-engine attacker that would not just carry armor, but be built around it. Instead of thin skins stretched over frames, the armor itself would be the aircraft's structure, a monocoque design, often compared to the strength of an eggshell. Inside this armored shell would sit the most vital organs of the plane: the pilot, the engine, the fuel tanks, even the radiators. Their prototype, the TSK-B-55, weighed nearly 4.7 tons when fully loaded. 15% of that weight was armor alone, an unheard-of figure at the time. To put it in perspective, that meant the cockpit and engine block were wrapped in more steel than some tanks of the First World War. When it flew for the first time on October 2nd, 1939, it shocked even its creators by staying airborne. Compared to the fragile fighters of the 1930s, this thing was a juggernaut. The Soviets suddenly had in their hands something the world had never seen: an aircraft that could survive gunfire, smash armored targets, and shrug off damage. The path to mass production wouldn't be easy, but the monster had been born. The TSK-B-55 had proven a concept, but it was far from perfect. Its AM-35 engine had been designed for high-altitude fighters, not the brutal low-altitude world of ground attack. Pilots quickly learned it was underpowered, sluggish, and dangerously heavy. If the Soviets wanted this plane to dominate over tank divisions, it needed a heart transplant. That transplant came in the form of the AM-38 engine, optimized for low-altitude combat. When Ilyushin's team built the improved prototype, the TSK-B-57, they cut the second seat to reduce weight, streamlined the design, and unleashed the power of the AM-38. Suddenly, the flying tank was no longer a slow beast, but a functional warplane. It wasn't graceful, but it was deadly, and more importantly, it was ready for the battlefield. In March 1941, the aircraft passed state trials and received its official name, the IL-2. Stalin himself took a keen interest in its development, understanding that the Red Army needed a weapon capable of halting the German blitzkrieg. The IL-2 was armored like no other, armed with heavy autocannons and designed to fly low, where it could hunt tanks, convoys, and bridges with brutal efficiency. By June 1941, production had barely begun when Operation Barbarossa erupted. The Soviet Union was caught off guard, its airfields shredded by Luftwaffe Luftwaffe raids, its forces collapsing under the German advance. Only 249 IL-2s had been delivered to frontline units, far too few to make an immediate difference. But the Soviet leadership knew what they had, a weapon that, if built in mass numbers, could tilt the battlefield. Factories were ordered to churn them out no matter the cost. Workers labored under crushing conditions, pushing themselves to exhaustion. Stalin's infamous telegram reminded them, "Our army needs IL-2s, like it needs air to breathe, like it needs bread to eat." The IL-2 wasn't just another airplane. It was to be the hammer that would smash the German war machine. When the German invasion began in June 1941, the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. Luftwaffe squadrons swept across the skies, blasting Soviet aircraft from their runways before they even had a chance to fight. Panzer divisions rolled forward like steel avalanches, cutting through Soviet defenses with terrifying speed. In this chaos, the IL-2 Sturmovik was still a newborn, powerful, but not yet available in the numbers needed to make an impact. Factories that had only just begun production suddenly faced disaster. Many were located near Moscow and in the Western territories now being swallowed by the Wehrmacht. Soviet industry had to perform a miracle. Entire factories, complete with workers, machinery, and blueprints, were uprooted and transported east of the Ural Mountains to keep them out of German reach. For 2 months, production all but ceased as trains carried the guts of Soviet aviation deeper into Russia's heartland. Every day lost meant more Soviet soldiers dying on the front. It was in this desperate moment that Joseph Stalin personally intervened. Furious at the delays, he sent a telegram that would become infamous among Soviet workers. In it, he accused aircraft directors of betraying their country and mocked their pitiful production rates. His words burned with menace. "You have let down our country and our Red Army. You have the nerve not to manufacture IL-2s until now. Our army now needs IL-2s, like the air it breathes, like the bread it eats. This is my final warning." The message was crystal clear: fail, and you'd be punished as traitors. Fear drove men and women to work around the clock, often sleeping on factory floors, eating scraps, and enduring brutal cold as winter set in. But the effort paid off. By the end of 1941, IL-2 production roared back to life. Dozens became hundreds, hundreds became thousands. Stalin would later call the IL-2 as essential to the Red Army as air and bread. The Soviets had gambled everything on this flying tank, and soon it would be tested in the fires of war. The first combat sorties of the IL-2 came just days after Barbarossa began, over the Berezina River in Belarus. Pilots had barely touched their machines before being thrown into action. Training had been rushed to the point of absurdity. Many were only taught how to take off and land. They had never fired the cannons, never practiced attack runs, and had no doctrine to guide them. These young men were essentially being hurled into battle with nothing but the armor of their machines and their own will to survive. At first, the results were brutal. The 4th Ground Attack Regiment, one of the first to fly the Sturmovik, lost 55 aircraft within weeks. Many were destroyed on the ground by Luftwaffe strikes. Others were shot down in combat as pilots fumbled through their missions. But in the chaos of these first operations, something became clear. The IL-2 was unlike any other plane. Pilots quickly realized that they could take punishment no other aircraft could endure. Machine gun fire bounced off its armored shell. Even flak that would tear apart a Yak or a P-2 often failed to bring down the Sturmovik. Despite their lack of training, IL-2 pilots attacked panzer divisions, shredded supply convoys, and blew apart bridges. For Soviet soldiers retreating on the ground, the sight of IL-2s diving into German tank columns was more than just a boost to morale. It was proof that the Red Army was still in the fight. German troops, on the other hand, quickly came to despise it. Infantry caught in open fields called it the Black Death. Tank crews, used to dominating battlefields with near invincibility, suddenly found themselves hunted from above. Still, the early losses were staggering. Soviet air crews needed new tactics, better training, and stronger coordination if the IL-2 was to survive against the Luftwaffe's superior fighters and devastating anti-aircraft defenses. The Sturmovik had proven it could draw blood. Now, the Soviets had to learn how to turn it into a true weapon of war. The early early months of the war proved one thing beyond all doubt. The IL-2 had potential, but potential alone wasn't enough to stop the German war machine. Pilots were flying low and straight at their targets, only to be cut apart by flak batteries or swarmed by Luftwaffe fighters. Losses mounted, morale wavered, and critics whispered that the Sturmovik was a waste of precious steel. But Soviet airmen refused to abandon it. Instead, they adapted. By late 1941, new attack formations began to emerge. Pilots stopped approaching in predictable straight lines. Instead, they used diving attacks from 30-degree angles, unleashing cannon fire and rockets on tanks before pulling up sharply. Others used a scissors tactic, pairs of IL-2s flying side by side, then splitting apart in opposite zigzags to confuse anti-aircraft gunners before converging again in deadly strafes. The most feared maneuver of all, however, was the Circle of Death. A squadron of IL-2s would dive onto a German convoy, strafe with cannon and bombs, then pull up and loop back around to rejoin the formation. Each aircraft followed the other in a continuous wheel, ensuring that the enemy below was under constant fire. To German soldiers pinned on the ground, it seemed endless, a rain of destruction with no pause, no escape. At the same time, the circular formation allowed each pilot to cover the tail of the one in front, creating a defensive shield against fighters. Armed with 23mm cannons, rockets, and bombs, the IL-2 became a hammer against armored columns. When rockets struck, entire Panzer IVs erupted in fire. Bombs cratered supply roads, leaving convoys stranded. Even if the IL-2 wasn't always precise, its ability to saturate an area with fire made it devastating against groups of vehicles. German reports confirm the psychological toll. Soldiers dreaded the distinctive roar of the AM-38 engine, describing the sound as the prelude to slaughter. In the mud and snow of the Eastern Front, where survival already seemed impossible, the appearance of the IL-2 overhead often sent troops into chaos. What had once been a struggling experiment was quickly transforming into one of the most feared weapons of the war. The IL-2 was unlike anything the world had seen, but its reputation as the flying tank was both truth and illusion. On one hand, its armor was revolutionary. Cockpits could withstand rifle fire, machine gun bursts, even hits from 20mm cannons. German soldiers nicknamed it the concrete bomber for good reason. Pilots told stories of limping home with wings shredded and engines coughing, only to land safely when almost any other plane would have been lost. For Soviet infantry watching from below, it became a symbol of hope, a machine that could take punishment and still strike back. But survivability came at a steep price. The IL-2 was heavy and sluggish. Against the agile Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the brutal Focke-Wulf FW-190, it was hopelessly outclassed. Without escorts, entire squadrons of IL-2s were massacred. Many Soviet pilots felt like bait, relying on armor to keep them alive long enough to release their payloads. Even then, half of all IL-2 losses came not from fighters, but from anti-aircraft guns. German flak batteries grew deadlier as the war went on, learning exactly how to time their fire against low-flying attackers. The Soviets tried to solve one of the plane's biggest weaknesses by reintroducing a second seat. Early IL-2s had started as two-seaters, but the gunner was cut to save weight. Now, as Luftwaffe fighters continued to slaughter unprotected Sturmoviks, the Red Air Force demanded gunners be added back. The first fix was crude. A hole was literally cut into the fuselage behind the pilot, where a gunner sat exposed with a 12.7mm machine gun. Armor protection was minimal, and casualty rates among gunners were horrifying. Later, purpose-built two-seater models improved the design, but even then, gunners remained far more vulnerable than pilots. Despite these flaws, the IL-2's armor did what it was designed to do: give Soviet pilots a fighting chance. Pilots learned to fly at treetop level, forcing enemy fighters to overshoot them, then counterattacking as the Germans tried to climb back into position. This tactic, combined with escorts from Yak fighters, allowed the IL-2 to survive long enough to fulfill its mission. The Sturmovik was a paradox, almost impossible to kill when it struck from above, yet vulnerable whenever the Luftwaffe caught it alone. But one thing was clear. In mass numbers, its presence on the battlefield was overwhelming. The Germans could shoot down dozens, but hundreds more would soon replace them. By the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front was preparing for what would become the largest tank battle in history, Kursk. German commanders threw everything they had into the offensive, unleashing thousands of panzers in a desperate gamble to break the Soviet defenses. For the Red Army, this was the proving ground for the IL-2 Sturmovik. If the flying tank could halt the German war machine here, its reputation would be cemented forever. During the battle, swarms of IL-2s descended on German armor columns, unleashing rockets, bombs, and cannon fire. Soviet propaganda claimed extraordinary success. Some reports boasted that in a single hour, one squadron of Sturmoviks destroyed 240 tanks, almost erasing the entire 17th Panzer Division. Newspapers carried stories of Sturmovik pilots swooping down like avenging angel, crushing German armor under relentless fire. To Soviet citizens starving for hope, it was a vision of retribution. But the reality was murkier. German records tell a very different story. At the time, the 17th Panzer Division didn't even have 240 tanks. In fact, it had fewer than 70 in working condition. The inflated Soviet numbers were not unusual. Official reports frequently exaggerated kills to maintain morale and impress Stalin's regime. Historians estimate that at Kursk, IL-2s were responsible for only 2 to 5% of total German tank losses. Most of the destruction came from Soviet anti-tank guns and minefield. That didn't mean the Sturmovik was ineffective. Far from it. What the IL-2 lacked in precision, it made up for in terror. German infantry cowered as Sturmoviks strafed trenches and convoys. Panzer crews, even when their tanks survived, often abandoned their vehicles under the pounding bombardments. The sound of IL-2 squadrons diving overhead, engines roaring, cannons hammering, became a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Kursk revealed both sides of the Sturmovik myth. It was not the tank-destroying miracle Soviet propaganda claimed, but it was still one of the most important weapons in breaking the morale and cohesion of German forces. Its strength lay not in single kills, but in overwhelming presence. Hundreds of aircraft blanketing the battlefield, ensuring that no German soldier ever felt safe. If Kursk showed the limitations of the IL-2, it also triggered a breakthrough that would make the aircraft far deadlier in the years to come. The Soviets knew the Sturmovik's problem wasn't power. It could carry heavy loads and deliver punishing strikes. The problem was accuracy. Hitting a single tank with a rocket or bomb while flying at high speed and under fire was nearly impossible. Engineers needed a way to turn the IL-2 into a weapon of mass destruction against armored columns. The answer arrived in 1943 with the PTAB, the Protivotankovaya Aviationная Bomba, or anti-tank aviation bomb. Unlike massive bombs meant for fortifications, the PTAB was small, just 2.5 kilograms, but deadly. Packed with high explosives and shaped charge technology, it could pierce up to 70 millimeters of armor, more than enough to rip through even the vaunted Tiger and Panther tanks. Here was the genius. Because they were so light, IL-2s could carry nearly 200 of them at once, loaded into special cassettes. Instead of relying on a handful of inaccurate rockets, a single Sturmovik could now carpet bomb an entire armored column with a storm of miniature tank killers. Tanks that survived the first wave were often immobilized, their tracks shattered, their formations thrown into chaos. Tactics evolved around the PTAB almost immediately. IL-2 squadrons would dive in at convoy columns, dropping hundreds of bombs in tight patterns. The circle of death maneuver became even more devastating, with wave after wave of PTABs raining down until the battlefield was littered with burning tanks. German crews began bolting on improvised armor plates, even laying logs across their vehicles in hopes of deflecting the bombs. It did little to save them. The introduction of the PTAB transformed the IL-2 from a blunt instrument into a precision terror. Suddenly, the propaganda was closer to reality. Columns of panzers could indeed vanish under a single strike. By late 1943 and into 1944, German commanders were forced to increase anti-aircraft defenses drastically, dedicating more guns and resources just to protect tank formations from the swarms of Sturmoviks overhead. What Kursk had revealed as a weakness, inaccuracy, had now been turned into a strength. The PTAB made the IL-2 not just a flying tank, but a tank killer. And for German soldiers, it reinforced the nightmare. When the roar of the Sturmovik filled the skies, nowhere was safe. Behind the iron shell of the IL-2 were men and women whose courage carved its legend into history. One of them was Anna Yegorova, a pilot who flew 243 combat missions. She survived being shot down, captured, and thrown into a German prison camp. Against all odds, she lived through the war and was decorated with the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union. For her, the IL-2 wasn't just a machine. It was a shield, a lifeline, and sometimes the only reason she made it home. Then there was Ivan Dychenko, who became one of the most decorated Sturmovik pilots, earning all 3 classes of the Order of Glory and the same Hero of the Soviet Union medal. His daring attacks on convoys and armor cemented the reputation of the Sturmovik as the scourge of German ground forces. And in perhaps the most audacious story of all, pilot Kuznetsov was shot down by a Bf-109, forced to crash land and hide nearby. When the German fighter landed to inspect the wreck, Kuznetsov seized his chance. He sprinted to the Messerschmitt, overpowered the pilot, and flew the German plane back to Soviet lines. That's the kind of desperation and bravery the war demanded, and the IL-2 seemed to inspire. By the end of the conflict, the numbers spoke for themselves. When Operation Barbarossa began, the Soviet Union had just 249 Sturmoviks. By 1945, over 36,000 had been built, making it the most produced combat aircraft of the entire war. It wasn't sleek like the Spitfire, it wasn't elegant like the Mustang, and it wasn't glamorous like the Lancaster, but it was everywhere. The IL-2 had become the backbone of Soviet air power, a machine designed for one purpose: to grind the German war machine into dust. Its legacy is complicated. Soviet reports often exaggerated its kill counts, leading some historians to call it overrated. Yet, on the battlefield, German soldiers didn't care about statistics. They feared it. They called it the Black Death. They dreaded its shadow on the horizon. For the Red Army, it was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of survival and defiance. And that's why the IL-2 Sturmovik will forever be remembered as the hammer of the Eastern Front, a machine built for brutality, flown by men and women who faced impossible odds, and feared by every soldier who stood against it. If you've stayed with us this long, make sure you subscribe for more World War II stories just like this, because the most disturbing details of history are the ones that keep getting buried, and we'll be here to dig them back up.